I still remember the night I first stepped through the ruined gates of Blackwater Asylum. The wind howled as the ancient door slammed shut behind me, almost as if it were warning me to turn back. In that instant, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the storm. "Leave now." My heart pounded, and every instinct screamed that I was in grave danger. Despite the fear, I couldn't tear myself away. Something deep inside urged me to uncover the asylum's secrets. The story of the caretaker who had met a mysterious death in his locked office decades ago. I clutched my flashlight and camera, determined to document what lay ahead, even if it meant facing the unknown. I ventured deeper into the dark, silent corridors, the only sounds the echo of my footsteps and the distant creak of old wood. My flashlight beam fell upon a heavy, rusted door marked Caretaker's Office. I had heard rumors about this room, the place where the caretaker was found dead under inexplicable circumstances. With trembling hands, I managed to force the door open. Inside, the room was shrouded in eerie half-light. On the cold, cracked floor lay a lifeless figure, and red stains darkened the walls. An old surveillance monitor flickered with static, displaying ghostly images that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I backed away from the macabre scene, the silence was broken by soft, shuffling footsteps behind me. Every nerve in my body screamed that something was there. I swung my flashlight around, only to catch fleeting shapes in the darkness, like figures formed of shadows. The static on the monitor began to distort, and in its broken images, I thought I saw the pale, anguished face of the caretaker reaching out. My hands shook as I recorded every second, the terror in the air almost tangible. In that moment of overwhelming dread, I noticed something even more disturbing. On the floor near the body was a handwritten note smeared with dried blood and scrawled in jagged letters, "He never left, and neither will you." As I read it aloud, my own voice echoed in the desolation. Then I glanced at the surveillance monitor again. My own reflection stared back at me, merged with the ghostly image of the caretaker. It was as if the spirit had been watching me all along, recording every moment of my intrusion. I felt an icy grip of realization. I wasn't just a visitor. I had become part of Blackwater Asylum's endless, haunted story. Panicking, I raced down the corridor, my footsteps echoing like a heartbeat in the oppressive darkness. Every door slammed behind me as if driven by an unseen force. The air grew colder and the whispers turned to desperate pleas. I reached a dead end, a long, narrow passage where the lights flickered violently. Suddenly, a chilling presence materialized at the far end, its form shifting between human and shadow. I froze as the figure's eyes glowed with a ghostly light. In a voice that wasn't entirely its own, it hissed, "You are next." The sound was so bone-chilling that I felt my soul nearly shatter. I bolted, every step a battle against paralyzing terror. I barely escaped that nightmare, gasping for air, soaked in sweat and trembling with terror. Once outside, I promised myself I'd never return. But even now, every time I review the footage on my camera, I see that haunting reflection and hear that whispered warning. I can't shake the feeling that the spirit of the caretaker, bound by a tragic fate, has followed me beyond those cursed halls. As I sit here in the safety of my home, I wonder if I'm truly free or if the asylum's darkness has seeped into my soul. And in the dead of night, sometimes I swear I hear its distant, sorrowful call, echoing in the silence. I still remember that night like it was yesterday. It was exactly midnight when my phone began to ring. I groggily answered, expecting a wrong number, until a voice, low and distorted, whispered, "It's time." My blood ran cold. That voice, it wasn't human. It was the echo of someone long dead. In that single moment, I knew my life would never be the same. The following nights, the calls kept coming. Every time, the same unsettling voice recited cryptic phrases, warnings of doom, echoes of lost lives. I tried to ignore them, chalking it up to a prank. But deep down, I felt that something was terribly wrong. I began to dread the sound of my phone's ring at midnight. I live in Pine Ridge, a quiet, forgotten town where everyone knows your name, yet secrets fester behind every door. I had heard murmurs of strange happenings for years, but nothing compared to what I was about to experience. The calls seemed to tie directly into the dark history of our town, a history of unsolved murders and restless spirits. One night the call was different. The voice was urgent, almost pleading. "Look behind you. The dead are coming." I froze. I turned slowly, and that's when I saw it. A dark figure lurking just beyond my doorway. I couldn't believe my eyes. I ran, heart pounding, as the voice continued its ominous warnings over the phone. My investigation into the calls led me to an old case file at the local records office. There, I uncovered a decades-old, unsolved murder that bore a striking resemblance to the cryptic messages I'd been receiving. The victim was a person no one in Pine Ridge had forgotten, a soul whose disappearance had haunted the town for generations. Suddenly, I realized that these calls weren't random pranks. They were messages from beyond, reaching out to warn me, or perhaps to lure me into the past. Then came the final call. My phone rang violently in the dead silence of the night. The voice was louder, angrier. "I warned you. Now it's your turn." I bolted out the door, driven by terror, only to see, in the cold light of the street lamp, that same dark figure chasing me down the empty road. I sprinted, my breath ragged, knowing that this was no longer just a warning. It was a hunt. I managed to hide that night, trembling in a cold, dark shed until dawn. Even now, I wake up in a cold sweat, my phone occasionally buzzing with a new message. I still don't know who or what that midnight caller really was. But one thing is certain, Pine Ridge will never be the same, and neither will I. I warn you, if you ever hear that chilling ring at midnight, be careful. Sometimes the dead never truly rest. This is my story, the terror of the midnight caller that still haunts me every night. I share it with you not to scare you for the sake of fear, but to remind you, sometimes our past never truly lets us go. Stay safe out there, and if you ever receive that unholy ring at midnight, run. And remember, it might already be too late. I was driving along Route 89 on a stormy, pitch-black night when something happened that still sends shivers down my spine. Out of nowhere, as my headlights cut through the relentless rain, I saw a figure standing by the roadside. I couldn't tell if it was real or a trick of the light until it moved. The figure, clad in tattered, outdated clothes, slowly began to beckon me with a bony finger. My heart pounded in my chest. I remember thinking, who or what could that be? Against my better judgment, I pulled over. My hands trembled as I rolled down the window, and the rain pounded against the car. The hitchhiker stepped forward with a slow, deliberate gait. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce right through me. I invited him into the car, and for a brief moment the oppressive atmosphere lifted, only to be replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread that settled deep in my bones. I tried to make small talk, but every word felt strained. His voice was soft, almost too quiet, yet it carried an unsettling echo. As he spoke, I noticed his hands were unusually cold and clammy, and there was something about the way he smiled, a slow, eerie curl that didn't reach his eyes. With every passing minute, the car seemed to grow colder, and I felt as if I were trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Just as I began to relax ever so slightly, something unexplainable happened. In the blink of an eye, the hitchhiker was gone. I reached out, heart hammering, but there was no one there, only the echo of his final, chilling whisper. "Stay with me." I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. Had I imagined it all? I checked the passenger seat. It was completely empty. Unable to shake off the feeling that something was horribly wrong, I stepped out into the rain. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. Fresh footprints leading from the roadside into the center of the highway. They were oddly shaped, as if left by someone or something with an unnatural gait. I followed them for a few steps, each imprint deepening the mystery of who had been there before me. I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. I remembered an old local legend about a hitchhiker from the 1970s who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only whispers and myths. As I drove on, my radio suddenly cut to static, and for a split second, I heard a voice whisper, "I'm not done." It was then that I found a tattered old photograph tucked under my seat. It showed a man in the same outdated clothes, his eyes void and sorrowful. Was this the same person? Was he warning me? That night as I drove alone, every shadow seemed to stretch and twist into monstrous shapes. Suddenly my car's rearview mirror flickered, and there, for a moment, I saw the phantom hitchhiker standing at the back of my car. My heart nearly stopped as I slammed on the brakes, and the figure vanished into the dark abyss of the highway. I realized then that the legend was real. The ghost was following me, forever bound to this cursed road. In that horrifying instant, I knew I was trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the phantom hitchhiker is still out there, waiting, watching, and forever bound to Route 89. Every night when the rain starts, I remember that cold whisper and those unnatural footprints. I've learned that some mysteries are best left unsolved, and some roads should never be traveled alone. I still drive that route occasionally, but the fear never leaves me. And if you ever find yourself on Route 89 on a stormy night, beware, because the phantom might be waiting for you too. I still remember the exact moment that changed my life forever. It was 2:13 a.m. on a bitterly cold autumn night when I awoke to a whisper, my name, soft and desperate, echoing from the depths of my closet. I froze, heart pounding, as a shadow flitted across my bedroom wall. I knew then that something was horribly wrong. I couldn't shake that voice. Compelled by equal parts fear and curiosity, I grabbed my flashlight and notebook and drove out to the infamous Whispering Woods, a place shrouded in local legend and silence. The road twisted through dense, leaf-strewn forests where every rustle seemed to speak secrets. Stepping out of my car, I was immediately engulfed by the damp, heavy air of the woods. Every sound was amplified, the crunch of dead leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and a constant, low murmur that seemed to come from nowhere. I walked slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand, as if it might flicker out at any moment. After what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled upon a small clearing. There, half buried in mud and fallen branches, lay an old battered tape recorder. Its casing was cracked and rusted, yet strangely intact. I felt an inexplicable pull. I knew this device held the key to the mystery of Whispering Woods. Back at my makeshift camp, I set up the tape recorder. As I pressed play, my skin crawled. The recording was raw and distorted, an agonized whisper, desperate pleas, and indistinct background sounds that seemed to be from another world. I could hear the faint voices of a young couple, speaking of terror and a presence that hunted them relentlessly. My blood ran cold as I listened, piece by piece, to their final moments. Just as I tried to make sense of the recording, a chilling sound cut through the static, a low, guttural growl followed by the unmistakable sound of crunching leaves. I spun around, flashlight darting wildly, and caught sight of a tall, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, time froze. I felt as if the figure was peering into my soul before it melted into the darkness. Panic surged through me as I bolted back toward the trail. I could hear the crunch of footsteps chasing me, the heavy breathing echoing behind every tree. The forest transformed into a maze of twisted branches and disorienting shadows. I ran blindly, not daring to look back, every step heavy with terror. The whispers grew louder, almost chanting my name. In a desperate bid for escape, I burst into a wider clearing illuminated by an unnatural pale light. In the center stood an ancient stone altar covered in strange symbols and dried blood. Suddenly, the whispers became a chorus, and a deep, otherworldly voice boomed, "You will join us." The reality of the curse struck me like a tidal wave. The woods were not just haunted, they were alive, hungry for souls. With my heart hammering, I stumbled backward. The chanting voices grew deafening, and the ground beneath me seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. I raced back along the path, my flashlight flickering as though possessed. Every shadow whispered threats until I finally reached the edge of the woods, where I collapsed in trembling relief. But even then, I felt the weight of those unseen eyes following me. I survived that night, but the memory never leaves me. Even now, as I recount these events, I still hear the voices, those haunting whispers that promise a return. I warn you, if you ever find yourself drawn to the secrets of Whispering Woods, remember that some mysteries are meant to remain hidden. I will never go back, and I pray you never do either. The woods will always remember, and they will call to you in the silence of the night. I still remember that night like it was yesterday. I was driving through the remote back roads of our small town when my headlights caught something that made my blood run cold. A forgotten grave, freshly disturbed, lying in a neglected cemetery. I pulled over, my hands trembling on the wheel, and stepped out into the chill night. The air was heavy with mist, and as I approached, I noticed strange symbols carved deep into the stone. It was as if someone or something had been there recently, trying desperately to leave a message. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I circled the grave, I discovered that the soil wasn't natural. It had been freshly turned, as if by desperate hands. The symbols, now clearer in the moonlight, looked almost like childish scribbles mixed with something older and far more sinister. I felt an inexplicable pull, a magnetism that urged me to learn more, even as my instincts screamed to run. Unable to resist the lure of the unknown, I decided to camp near the cemetery that very night. I set up my small tent on the edge of the graveyard, my only company a weak, flickering lantern. As midnight approached, the silence was shattered by the soft sound of footsteps and a faint, almost inaudible whisper. I stepped out into the darkness, and in the eerie glow of my lantern, I saw it. A shadowy figure, no larger than a child, hovering near the grave. Its eyes were empty voids, and it seemed to be watching me, silently pleading for something lost. The next morning, while combing through the area for clues, I stumbled upon an old cassette recorder hidden among the underbrush. Curiosity overcame caution, and I took it back to my car. When I pressed play, a distorted, trembling voice filled the silence. A child's whisper, barely audible yet piercingly clear. "Leave me alone." That single broken sentence sent shivers down my spine and echoed in my mind long after the tape had stopped. As I continued to investigate, I began to feel that I was no longer alone. Late one night, while reviewing the recording on my phone, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned, and there it was again, a spectral child, pale and sorrowful, its eyes filled with an unspoken plea and hidden rage. I felt as if this forgotten soul was reaching out, cursed to remain trapped in that forsaken place, and now it had chosen me. That night, as I sat in my car trying to steady my racing heart, I heard unmistakable footsteps outside. Then a child's laughter, soft, eerie, and chilling, filled the air, followed by a blood-curdling scream that shattered the silence. I couldn't stay still any longer. I bolted from the car and ran, the sound of those ghostly giggles and the sight of that tormented child's face burning into my vision. I sprinted through the cemetery, the terror clawing at my mind with every step. I fled that accursed place that night, but the curse of the forgotten child has haunted me ever since. I now hear its soft whispers in the silence of every dark hour. I feel its cold, unseen gaze following me wherever I go. If you ever stumble upon a disturbed grave with fresh soil and bizarre symbol, if you sense a presence that should never be there, please run, because once the curse finds you, it never truly leaves. This is my story. The curse of the forgotten child is real, and its horror is eternal. Remember, some secrets are best left undisturbed. Sleep well if you can.